On Sunday afternoon, I found out that my flight, among thousands of others, were canceled. Even at that point, I did everything but find ways to get myself together for the snow that was already in the midst of falling pretty heavy. No, rather, I thought I'd just go to my brother's house. He lives down the street, and I can download some music on my iPod in my spare time. To this day, I'm still not sure why I thought that was a good idea. But it just goes to show more and more how I wasn't taking the snow that was already falling even the slightest bit seriously. Well, I made it to my brother's, and the roads weren't that bad at that point, and I figured I'd stay about an hour or so and then head back out. And when I finally did get around to heading back home, it was at the peak of the storm. And when I got in my car, when my car wasn't swerving, I could barely see a thing. Now, the first time I got stuck, notice I said the first time, was on Route 1. And then a woman behind me, she was just so frustrated, she got out of her own car to push me. I just shrugged my shoulders and figured, whatever. I was able to get things going. That took about 5 minutes. The second time I got stuck, a nice couple came along, a woman and a man, to push me. It took about a half hour. Now, at this point, the snow was falling heavier and heavier because this was about 7:30, 8 o'clock. The third time I got stuck, this was the time where I took out my cell phone, I called out my friends, none of which were anywhere to be found. My parents were in North Carolina. My brother made it clear that he was not coming back out. He didn't want both of us to be stuck. So I decided to just keep trying. So I looked in the back of my car, I looked in my trunk, I looked everywhere for a shovel or something, but I had nothing. There was nothing in my car that I kept there that would keep me and help me in the case of a blizzard. I didn't even have a scraper. And unless the latest issue of Essence magazine could dig up snow, I realized that I was in trouble. I just sat there and waited and hoped that some nice person would come along and help me. And then when help finally came, it took about 4 people to dig me out. And that took well over an hour. I was cold, I was wet, I was numb, I couldn't even think straight. I was so angry. And when I was finally able to get the car moving, I couldn't even park in my own lot. I had to go to some random store lot and then walk home. Now, later on that evening, when I was having my own pity party, I was on the phone with a friend of mine explaining everything that happened. I was expecting a little pity. And I was extra dramatic about the story, just so that I would get I feel so bad for you. I was thinking, maybe he'd feel bad, especially if I was really, really dramatic. And then when all I said was done, he finally says to me, "Now, what about the term blizzard didn't you understand?" Then he says, "Now, what was the lesson that you learned from all of this, Khristi?" And it reminded me of what Jesus said in this passage. He said, "Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that the end is near, right at the door." So why had I decided to completely ignore the forecast? The signs were everywhere. On the news, the cancellation of major events. The sky even started to look a little gray. And even when the snow began to fall, I decided to go out driving in it. I still didn't get it. And because I completely ignored it, I wasn't prepared for it. And because I wasn't prepared for it, I fell victim to it. And I can't even say that the snow took me by surprise because there were signs everywhere. The blizzard was coming, whether I was ready or not. Now, Matthew 24 is all about signs. If there was any one chapter in the Bible that I used to avoid like the plague, it was this one. This and the entire book of Revelation. It's like its own scary movie. Doom and gloom and dread and distress. I like to focus on happy scriptures like, I came that you might have life and life more abundantly. Rejoice in the Lord. And again, I say rejoice. Scriptures that make you feel really good about yourself. But this chapter offers us a different kind of reality. Now, at some point in the beginning of the chapter, Jesus sparks the curiosity of the disciples concerning future events. Enough for them to ask Jesus, now tell us, when are these things going to happen? What are going to be the signs? And Jesus doesn't quite answer the first one, when exactly, but he does answer in depth the latter part of the question. He says, these will be the signs. And this is where Jesus begins his prophetic discourse. We've often heard the word prophecy being thrown around. People prophesying houses and cars, but this is prophecy in its fullness. Not intended to gratify the curiosity of the disciples, but rather to guide them, to help prepare them for the events that will happen. Now, some of what he does and some of what he says does have to do with immediate events that were specific to the people of their time. But a lot of what Jesus says looks far forward. It's a message for the entire church, which included the church of their time and the church of 2011 and all the churches in between and far beyond. He gives a kind of forecast. And like this past week's blizzard, the forecast didn't really look so appealing. Famines and earthquakes, and he says things like the love of many are going to grow cold and there's going to be a great tribulation. It's not a pretty picture that he paints. And there's still a lot about this text that I am completely clueless about. I'm wondering, what parts include me? How does this affect the people that I care about? I'm thinking to myself, well, most of this has happened. Most of this is happening, and I believe that we can all agree that it doesn't matter how much we hide behind our television screens or our material things, or in order to stay in our own little perfect utopian world that we try to escape in to avoid facing these realities. It's going to happen whether we're ready or not. It's all listed right here. And we can skip over the entire chapter 24 and pretend like it doesn't exist. Or we can take the advice that Jesus gave us. He said, keep watch. He tells us to be ready. He says, now understand this. Now learn this lesson. All throughout the chapter, he's saying things like this. And I used to think that whenever somebody preached on this chapter, it was always about hellfire and brimstone. And 9 times out of 10, it was. You better get ready or else. But Jesus warns us because he loves us. Because he wants us to be prepared. He could have opted not to tell us anything at all. He could have left us completely in the dark, but instead he gives us the hard truth. And whether we choose to accept it or not, whether we choose to prepare for it or not, it's going to happen. Now, the point that we begin at in the text for this morning, Jesus gives 4 different illustrations practically in the same breath. And when you get a chance and when you go home later, take a look at it. Because I thought it was so interesting that he sort of crammed all of those examples in one after the other. First there's the lesson of the fig tree. Then there's the example of how it was in the days of Noah. He talks about the men in the field and the women grinding. And then finally, there's the example of the owner of the house and the thief. Now, you'd think that the lesson of the fig tree was enough, but clearly it wasn't. Jesus was trying to get his point across. And I remember when I first read this text, when I was younger, I wanted to say, we get it, you're coming soon. But I'm afraid that just like the way I handled the news of the impending blizzard is the way that most of us handle the significance of this end times message. Don't wind up like I was, completely disregarding the warning signs and stuck in the snow.